Welcome to a brand new episode of Identity Talk for Educators Live, the show for the unsung heroes of education. I'm your host, Kwame Sarfo-Mensah, and if this is your first time tuning in to the podcast, I welcome you and I hope that today's episode is one that you find informative, enlightening, and insightful. And for those who are returning as viewers or listeners of the podcast, I also hope that today's episode is one that you find informative, enlightening, and insightful. But before we get into our conversation for tonight, just a reminder for those who are on YouTube, hit that subscribe button so you can get future notifications on new episodes of not only this podcast, but of our other podcast, Radical Math Talk, which is still growing. We are also on Apple Podcast, Spotify, and all other platforms where you listen to your podcast. So make sure you subscribe there as well. And for those who would like to help us grow this platform and contribute monetarily through donation, we do accept donations through Cash App and Venmo. So for Cash App, the handle would be money sign ID Talk 4ED. And then for Venmo, it will be at Kwame SM. So that's KWAMESM. And then, of course, if you want to catch past episodes of the podcast, you can visit our home website at identitytalk4educators.com. So make sure y'all check us out. Thank you kindly. Right. So today's conversation is focused on a topic that is very personal for me because as someone who grew up in a classroom where I had an IEP and I was receiving support from special educators, is something that hits me personally. And, we've done some episodes in the past about ableism and how it manifests itself within our school system. And I feel like there's so much more to unpack with regard to that and how it intersects with the work that we're doing with anti-racism in education that I wanted to bring on another guest who can elaborate even further and take it to another level about how it looks and what we can do to combat it as educators, but also community members, because we have to understand our parents and our other community members are stakeholders of the education process, and they too can play an important role in combating ableism within our schools. So I want to bring on someone who has a wealth of experience as a special educator, as an inclusion specialist, and currently is doing research around this issue. So, without further ado, I want to bring on April Boyce to the podcast to talk with us about ableism and how it intersects with the work that we're doing within this anti-racism movement. So, let's bring April on. Hello.
Hey,
How are you?
doing well. How about yourself?
Not bad. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Excited to be here.
Yeah. I know we were trying to do this a little earlier, but listen, life happens. I know I was busy. I know you're busy with a lot of things, particularly your doctoral work. So I'm thankful that we're able to finally connect and have the time to have this conversation.
Yeah, same. Thanks for being flexible with my schedule.
Is not a problem. This conversation is more than worth the wait. So, before we get into the main theme of tonight's talk, I want to give you just a chance to share a little bit about your upbringing. So I know that you are residing in the Seattle area, the Pacific Northwest,
hmm
where there's a lot of racial equity work going on. Um, and you're doing your part. But before we even get to the educator life, just talk to me about your upbringing and what ultimately brought you into this education field.
Yeah, so I am a Filipino American living in Seattle, Washington, the land of the Coast Salish people, and I immigrated here when I was 4 years old. I'm currently in my first year of my doctoral program at the University of Washington, and my focus is on critical special education and intersectional justice. And for previous experience, I've worked in this field for a little over 11 years now, starting as an early childhood educator and teaching preschool, teaching Head Start, and also worked on some research on childcare quality improvement. And then I taught in an elementary school as an accessibility and inclusion specialist for about 3 years before starting my doctoral program this fall. And before we start chatting more, I just want to also mention that I am doing this work with a discrit lens, and discrit is a theory that was coined by Dr. Subani Anima, and basically it's the meshing of disability studies and critical race theory. So I approach this work through a very critical lens that focuses on the intersections of ability and race. And when my platform started growing, I was a special education teacher and had lots of followers on TikTok that were mostly educators and school like counselors and psychologists. And so, yeah, I just want to share that like my beliefs, a lot of my knowledge has shifted over the past couple of years, all thanks to so many disabled individuals, BIPOC individuals, disability activists that are just sharing their stories and perspectives. And so some of the things that I'll be talking about today might be like new information, might be kind of shocking, might make some folks feel uncomfortable, but sitting in that discomfort and unlearning is all part of this work. And so I just want to put that out there before we start.
Well, I appreciate you for even bringing all that to our attention. So you mentioned discrit, which is a branch of critical race theory intersected with disability studies. So I think that's a pretty good place for us to start, because I know for myself, I've heard of the term, but I can't say that I can speak in depth about it. So what can you say about discrit? Are there tenets just like there are with critical race theory?
Mm-hmm. Yes, there are tenets. There's 7 of them. I don't want to get into all the details. But basically it's just saying that we need to be approaching these systems through both looking at racism and ableism and how they intersect. So maybe I can start with like talking about ableism.
Sure.
Okay, so Talila T.L. Lewis, TL is an abolitionist community lawyer and educator, and I really love TL's definition of ableism, defining it as like the system of oppression that places values on individuals' bodies and minds, all on ideas of normalcy, intelligence, excellence, and productivity that are all socially constructed. And these ideas are strongly connected to anti-Blackness, capitalism, colonialism, really just all the isms. And one thing that TL says is that you don't have to be disabled to experience ableism. So ableism is all about the idea of who is valuable and worthy based on how a person looks or their ability to produce, to reproduce, to do well in society. So that's kind of the definition of ableism that I like to go off of. And so I know that we're talking to educators right now. And so when we think about ableism in schools, the main thing that most people think about is, using harmful words like the R word, or structural things like inaccessibility in old buildings. So like the lack of ramps and elevators in multi-story buildings. But people don't really think about special education as being ableist, right? Many think that students receive services through an IEP and they're getting their rights and that they need and that they deserve. And yeah, that's great. We have many disability rights and disability justice advocates to thank for that. And getting your accommodations and modifications through IDEA is great to an extent. And I think the problem is for many students, they're being segregated into separate classrooms, self-contained classrooms, either for the whole day or for part of the day. And so this segregation of disabled kids from their non-disabled peers, even if they're receiving the services that they need or that we deem that they need, is inherently ableist, because special education and a lot of other institutions actually that operate in our society function through this lens of what's called the medical model. And through this model is the current dominant societal belief that a person with a disability is a problem and that they need to be cured, or that the disability is something that can and should be overcome. And so they need to be, they need to be fixed because they display unusual behavior, or they're unable to communicate, or they're a safety concern for others, or that they need to learn to be independent because right now they just need too much support. So special education was designed to fix these students through interventions and supports. And many goals that we see on IEPs or individualized education plans, they're all about getting a student to conform to what non-disabled, neurotypical, usually white kids look like and sound like and act like, because that's the only way to be included in the general education classroom. Yeah, that was a really long tangent, but that's kind of how ableism shows up in schools. And it can show up in schools in a lot of other ways too, right? Not just the desegregation of students, but in ways that we don't even think about, like grading policies, attendance policies, tardy policies, behavior management strategies, right? Kicking kids out of class. We don't see these as ableist because they're just so deeply ingrained in our practices, and they're just the way things are, so we keep doing them. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's why I wanted to have another conversation about ableism, because as you can see, there's so much to unpack with regard to that. And one thing that I can say about it is, when people think about ableism, they think, okay, this only involves students with disabilities. But able-bodied people can experience ableism as well, in different ways. So can you speak a little bit more about that? Because I think that's a misconception that I've witnessed very often with regard to ableism and conversations around that.
Yeah, so this idea that like ableism connects to things like racism and like meritocracy and capitalism, like it impacts all of us. Like we have all experienced at some point in our lives feeling inferior, right? Based on how we look, or how what we feel is our level of intelligence based on the people around us. I know I feel that a lot in higher ed, which is filled with ableist systems. Yeah, it's something we can all experience. And I also want to the understanding of ableism is something that can bring us into this work, because I do want to mention, like, we all can experience ableism, but disability is something that we don't all experience, right? And especially, being at the intersections of disability and race, that's not something everybody can experience.
Right.
So I just want to separate those two and make sure that we're not confusing, yeah, we're all experiencing ableism. Yes, but there's people that have disabilities or are being disabled by society. And those are real lived experiences that we have to honor. So, yeah, I think so. Going back to that medical model of disability, I don't actually think I presented what the alternative view of that is, right? So a way that we can look at disability differently is through a social model. And through that social model, we believe that it's not the individual that's the problem, but actually the society that's disabling people. So the fact that buildings lack ramps and elevators, that's a barrier that disables individuals. The fact that schools aren't equipped with flexible seating options for kids that need to sit, on the floor or stand or bounce while they do their work, that's a barrier for kids to access their learning. So to summarize, social model of disability seeks to increase access and remove barriers that prevent individuals with disability from fully participating in society. And I also want to bring up this tension that, some people might be thinking like, well, if society is the problem, then we just need to fix all the structures and institutions. And then technically no one would be disabled because we all experience ableism and it's a social construct, right? And that's a good point, but it's not the reality, right? And we don't want to think in this binary. This work to dismantle these systems is a long road. And while we can start understanding that disability is just a part of human diversity, it's also still very much a social identity. And we have to honor that, that people are living these experiences and oppressions that disable them.
And I think there's also a cultural stigma that's attached to it as well. I know growing up, so my parents are from Ghana, West Africa. So if you were someone that had special needs or had a learning disability, the perception was you weren't intelligent, or the perception was that there's something wrong with you or you're cursed. And that's how it is in a lot of different cultures, not just in West African culture or Caribbean culture, right? But other cultures as well. Just this cultural stigma that's attached to it that also plays a role in how we perceive intelligence and how we perceive academic achievement and all these other indicators.
Yeah, and I think that these beliefs, we have to look at our history.
Yeah.
Like the historical context is so important because there's so many examples that we can point to in history that show how intertwined and deeply rooted these systems of oppression are, and how they shape our thinking about disability and race.
Yes.
So, like one example was in the mid 1800s when enslaved Africans that ran away were identified as having something called drapetomania, which was supposed to be like a mental illness that caused them to flee captivity. Because white people said that slavery was so great, why would anyone want to run away? Right? Pretty ridiculous. And we saw this in like residential schools that ripped indigenous children from their families and their homes and made them assimilate into white American society because their goal was to kill the Indian, save the man.
Right.
And then the development of the IQ test, which, we've all talked about how problematic standardized testing is, right? But these tests were developed by these white psychologists that tailored to white English-speaking kids. So, I'm sure you can guess who was labeled as unintelligent, right? The Black, brown, immigrant kids, disabled kids.
Yeah.
And like immigration laws in the late 1800s also denied entry to the US to those that had mental illnesses. And, the eugenics movement, like there's so many things in history of how attributing disability to other groups has kind of made discrimination justifiable, right? So like school leaders are saying like, no, we're not racist. We're not separating kids by race. We're separating them because they're disabled. But yeah, school segregation did not end after Brown versus Board. And ableism and racism are very much alive and well today.
Very much so. So as you were talking, I think you alluded to some different trends that are still happening in our schools. So one example is tracking. Tracking is still happening where we're categorizing our learners just based on perceived ability, which usually stems from how they're performing on standardized tests, which is also something that has been problematic. And it's something that, as a teacher, it just never made sense to me how we have so many experts, quote unquote, tell us that we need to differentiate. We need to use models such as UDL, Universal Design for Learning. I mean, there's a lot of terms that are pretty much speaking to just the idea of making sure that we're catering and accommodating for the diverse needs of learners. But then we look at standardized tests, everything is normed. And I'm thinking about not just our students with IEPs and 504 plans, but you have emerging bilingual students who aren't getting the accommodations that they need, but yet they're being assessed in the same manner as those who aren't receiving those accommodations or don't have those plans. So I don't know. What are your thoughts about that?
That's a big question. I mean, there's so much wrong with the system as it is, and that points to just how whiteness shows up in schools, and how schools were created by white people for white children, white English-speaking children, and it's nothing has changed. So
yeah, I mean, it's just crazy how as the years go by, so much is still the same.
Exactly.
Even with all the information, all the evidence, all the research that's been done, we're still doing a lot of the same things. And you have a lot of folks who just aren't willing to change or do away with problematic practices that are continuing to harm students. But I do want to stay on this idea of whiteness for a second, because it's something that's very central to the research you're doing with regard to the intersection between ableism, but also racism within our schools. So we have people in the audience, people listening to us who probably have no idea how whiteness shows up. Not just in schools, but more specifically within the special education realm. So, I mean, obviously, there are a lot of examples we can touch on. You've already said a few, but what are some common situations where whiteness is highly prevalent within the realm?
Yeah. So there's just, in general, the idea that Black and brown kids are damaged. Like, there's just so much deficit thinking around children that are not white, right? Like the belief that everybody's homes are chaotic because there's always a bunch of people coming in and out, that parents are uninvolved, just the lowered expectations and just the deficit thoughts, and like misconstruing certain behaviors, like talking out loud, like talking out of turn, cultural things that are not valued in white spaces. And right, of course, grading policies, standardized tests, those are all favoring white, non-disabled, English-speaking kids. And there's evidence that there's a disproportionate rate of BIPOC students, mostly Black and Latinx and Latine students, that are disciplined and referred to special education programs. And they typically qualify under categories like learning disabilities or emotional behavioral disorders or disturbances, Whereas middle class parents, they have more of a means to pay for expensive testing to get their children with more labeled with like autism or dyslexia or ADHD, like more like palatable or socially acceptable labels. You know what I mean? So yeah. Anyways, the disabled students of color are just thought of as needing to be fixed. And I dropped a truth bomb earlier that special education is ableist and it's also racist. And our Black and brown students with disabilities are at this intersection, and it's just a really dangerous place to be. And this is the case because like there's policies and teaching practices, the rules and behavioral expectations that we have in schools, again, designed not with them in mind. And thinking about like white supremacy culture, a lot of the characteristics show up in schools and specifically special education. So this idea of perfectionism, that the dominant idea of trying our best not to make mistakes and always trying to fix our work so we can improve our grade. Another is this sense of urgency. So kids are often rushed through their assignments and teachers are on a time crunch and they want to get through their lesson. So they don't give kids enough time to really process their thinking or finish their work. And tied to that is like this idea of quantity over quality. So we just like want kids to produce work and they want them to produce a lot of it. So like write 500 words, but like a lot can still be said in only 100 words. Like why do you have to make them write 500 if they can say it succinctly in like 100? Right? And then of course like individualism is a big one. So this idea of independence, and we value independence way too much. But what people don't realize is that none of us are truly independent because someone made this computer that I'm talking to you on. Someone sewed the clothes that I'm wearing. Farmers harvested the food that I had for dinner, right? And the earth, Mother Earth, has generously gifted us this place to live and breathe and all these things that we take for granted. So like independence is a myth. So yeah, all these things I mentioned, like they're often related to the goals that I used to write for my students. In reflecting on my own work, like student X will check their work before turning it in so that they'll reduce their mistakes on a math assignment from 5 wrong answers to 2 wrong answers. Or student Y will respond to a teacher within 30 seconds of being given a prompt, or else they'll get kicked out of the classroom, basically. Student Z will walk to the bathroom independently, not get distracted, and go back to class within 5 minutes. Like really unrealistic things. But better, you do better. So I would not write goals like that anymore if I were to go back to teaching. But yeah, the goal of schools since its inception has been all about getting kids to conform to white kids. And another example are like the basic expectations of elementary schools. So like eyes are looking at the teacher, ears are listening to the teacher, your voices are quiet, your bodies are calm. And this doesn't work for kids with autism or ADHD. And on a cultural level, things like eye contact or being passive is not a value for every child and every family. And just like the general nature of children is not to sit calmly and quietly. Like they are active learners and they want to talk and be with their community and move around, right? So very unrealistic expectations that are problematic because those that can't comply with them are disciplined, labeled, and often referred to as special education. And most often it's the students of color.
Very often. And that's just a known fact. But another thing that I've noticed, and I'm guilty of this too, is this idea of paternalism. But usually in the context of over scaffolding, right? We we provide these different tasks for our students, and we have this perception or belief that, you know what, this may be too difficult, this may be too hard for them, so let me just do things on behalf of them in their
Mhm.
interest without taking the time to consult with them to see, hey, what do you think about this task? Or, what are your thoughts about it? I think we always come in with the best of intentions, but in the process, we have these implicit beliefs about the way our students learn that in essence harm them
Mhm.
or hinder their ability to develop and to become independent learners or to be critical thinkers, right?
Yeah.
So I think that was something that I definitely noticed. And I think it goes back to what you're saying. There are a lot of people who, when they see someone that has an IEP, for instance, the automatic assumption is, okay, we got to help them. We have to fix them.
Mhm.
They're not able to do the same cognitively demanding work as those who do not have an IEP. So there's always these assumptions that are out there.
Right. Yeah, and there's this idea in special education and general education that like we always try to fade supports. Like we don't want this child to always need to use, speech to text
Hmm.
or a spell checker because I don't know. I don't even because I mean I use that stuff all the time as a grown up,
Sure.
right? So why do we need to try to fade it from these kids so that they can be more independent?
Yeah. And then I would also think that those scaffolds are important for students to use. And if a student is demonstrating the ability to use the scaffold appropriately, isn't that not a form of metacognition? Isn't that not a way for them to demonstrate that, hey, I know how to properly use it to inform my learning and to be successful academically and to do these different tasks. I
Mm-hmm.
think because that's showing you that how you know the way that you learn,
Right.
the
Yeah.
way that you process information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's okay to need tools and accommodations. I would be nowhere without my phone, right? To schedule my life. I need my digital calendar, you know, and texting. These are all tools that if somebody took it away from me, I would have a hard time just getting through my day. Um, and so, yeah, I think we really need to rethink support and just that idea of independence. Like we're all interdependent on things and on each other, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
So I think that's an idea that we should really start rethinking.
Right. And as you're speaking about this, I'm cringing in my mind about some of the things that I did. So I was a math teacher at the middle school level. And when I first came into the space, I was that teacher who said, listen, y'all can't use a calculator for this task. If you're like a true mathematician, you should be able to do certain things mentally. So I would frown upon certain students who would use a calculator to do, let's say, 3 plus 4, right? Something that I would deem as basic.
Mm-hmm.
But I never took the time to consider the context of when they were using the calculators and the why. But through unlearning, I realized, okay, I'm perpetuating these different characteristics of white supremacy that you've already mentioned um, in my own practice. And I'm supposed to be someone who is all about being equitable and making sure that I am being mindful and empathetic, to my students based on their needs. So I'm just cringing as you're speaking.
Yeah, I mean, we all, right. I mean, every day I think about something I did in the past and think about, I also cringe, think about what I could do better. And I think it just shows how deeply ingrained some of these ideas are in all of us. We do these things very implicitly. And so I think the first step is just being aware and acknowledging that what we've done in the past, we could do better.
And I want to talk to you about just the whole evaluation process of getting students an IEP, right? Because I think that's something that's important. And I've seen different situations of that. Being an inclusion teacher who's had students with IEPs in my class, students with 504s, emerging bilinguals who are getting support. I've witnessed, and this is kind of a double-edged sword because we talked earlier about the stigma, some of the negative stigmas and the implicit narratives that are tied to students of color who have IEPs. But we also know that there's the element of capitalism that's involved when we talk about the number of students with IEPs within a school. And we think about the fact that the more students with IEPs within a school, the more money a school's able to get based on their status, whether they're Title I or whatever their status is economically. So there are a lot of different things that happen. So I've seen students who legitimately needed an IEP get rejected because the school didn't want to go past a certain number. They just put a cap on the number of students who were getting an IEP. But then I've also seen parents advocate for students who may not have needed an IEP based on evaluations, but they knew that if their student had an IEP, if their child had an IEP, they'll be able to navigate the system in a way that they can exploit the different services that they can receive. But then there are students who could have used those services. So I feel like there's a double-edged sword there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I I don't know
I know it's
all the ins
crazy.
and outs of the system, and I do I the part about parents advocating for their kids that might be okay without an IEP, that resonates with me. Because I think we talked about it a little bit earlier about how some parents have the means to advocate for their children to get services and supports. Usually the white families, and other families don't. And so, yeah, there's definitely inequalities, huge inequalities within special education because of that. Right? The Black kids go to EBD programs, the white kids go to inclusion programs. That's kind of the trend that I've seen in my experience. So, yeah.
Yeah, there's just so much there. And what a lot of people don't realize, even myself, is that even when you get to the college level, the undergraduate level, you could still get an IEP at that level.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't realize that until I went through premarital counseling, and I was going through all these different assessments, like cognitive assessments and other assessments. And the psychologist was like, it's amazing that you were able to go through your entire K-12 schooling with all these different compensatory strategies, to get through the different stages of your learning. Because my processing speed was slower compared to a lot of my classmates. So I needed more time, more wait time to process new concepts, to learn different topics and different units. But I always viewed it as, well, that's just how I'm built. I didn't see it as a learning disability that warranted an IEP, which would have given me extra time or extended time when it came time for midterms and finals. So, clearly I turned out okay, but the fact that I wasn't aware that there was a service available for me at the undergraduate level, it just speaks volumes to just how uninformed and even misinformed we are when it comes to the whole process,
right,
of getting those services.
Yeah, and like I actually just read an article about how underrepresented people with disabilities are in higher education, because in high school they're not taught even about like how to apply, or that they could even get in. So yeah, definitely a lot of misinformation or uninformation, that's a word, about higher ed. Yeah, and I mean, just higher ed in general is just like very ableist. I find myself struggling through the readings that I have to go to, because there's like these academic papers are just, they're just gatekeeping. Like, I cannot understand what you're saying, and I feel like you could have said that in like a shorter amount of words than you just did. That's how I feel when I read articles. Yeah. And so there's a lot of really great professors that are kind of rethinking their syllabi, and just being more humanizing, being more flexible with students, and letting them know that, we know you have lives outside of school. Just let us know if you need an extension. And just like extending that invitation to everybody. So that's promising, at least in my institution.
Right. So, and just speaking on just institutions of higher learning in general. So we know that at the K-12 level, we have special education departments. We have inclusion specialists. We have accessibility specialists at that level. But then when you go into college, you pretty much have to fend for yourself. Those services aren't there. You have your professors who are going to teach how they're going to teach. And if you have that professor like the one you mentioned, who is being mindful and empathetic and considerate of the students who are in the classroom, then you've hit the jackpot. But more times than not, that's not the case for a lot of students. So do you feel like that's something that should carry over into the higher ed level if we're going to be consistent?
Yeah, I think at the high school level, I think there should be more talk about, being self-determined and advocating for yourself, and just knowing more of the ins and outs about higher education before going into it. And then, yeah, I think if departments and programs had, kind of a case manager for, and maybe some do. I'm not really familiar with how that works in higher ed, but yeah, I do know, there's an application process that you have to go through to get your accommodations. submitted to your professors. But definitely there should be some sort of wraparound type thing.
Yeah, because I just keep thinking, like you mentioned the fact that you read certain publications, and I know you're in the process of doing your doctoral work, so you're reading publications. You probably have to do a lit review, really soon, for your dissertation. And there are publications that they just use highly sophisticated academic jargon that you and I may understand, and there may be some terms where we have to go to a glossary just to decipher or uncover what the author is saying, right? But then you just have to wonder, when people make these publications, do they do it just to prove how smart they are? Or are they being mindful of the readership? Because for certain folks who are doing their doctoral program, they need extra time they might need to read that publication 3, 4, or 5 different times to really understand what it is that is being communicated in that publication. So I don't know. I just feel like professors and researchers to academia, they should have to take the same kind of courses or go through the same professional development that we had to go through at the K-12 level as it pertains to just special education, as it pertains to the importance of inclusion and the importance of just differentiation and understanding
Yeah.
learning styles and just pedagogy in general.
Yep. There's definitely, I mean, a lot of professors that are at like research institutions. So there's, University of Washington is a research institution, so they focus on research versus teaching institutions where like you have teaching colleges that pump out teachers. So yeah, there's definitely, I think, for some people just that missing pedagogy piece, and I'm experiencing that in my own time at UW. Like some professors are doing really great. Like they are assigning things that aren't super dense. They're making sure that they're screen reader accessible, and that they're assigning like podcasts and like TikTok videos and like other kinds of media to consume that are like just way more accessible. But then there's other professors that are assigning like 100 pages a week of readings, and it's just like completely unreasonable. And pedagogy is just not quite there. So
Yeah, and I think when you look at the different professors there, you have your adjunct professors, and there's a good percentage of them who are who teach at the K-12 level, and then maybe 2, 3 nights a week they'll teach a class at the university. So they'll come in with that K-12 mindset, and they'll try to structure their class similar to how they would structure the class that they teach during the day. So
right.
there is they have that background to where they can do that. But then if you're talking about professors at research universities, whether it's a research 1 or research 2 university, because we know there's differences there. A lot of professors have been in that space for a long time, whether they're tenured or they just have relationships with trustees within those universities.
Yep.
So they're not they're not held accountable for updating their instructional practice or their pedagogy, because because they're tenured. So it's like, I could be the crappiest professor, I'm gonna still have a job at the end of the day, regardless of what the evaluations say, regardless of the feedback that I get. So there's a lot that happens at that level that helps to perpetuate a lot of ableism that we've been speaking of.
Right. Yeah. And there's so many professors that, might not be retiring because even though there's new professors coming in with more critical ideas that want to kind of move the field forward. Yeah. So definitely seeing some of that.
Right.
Sure.
So you definitely see the shift happening where we're starting to challenge those traditional ideals of academia.
Mm-hmm. Yep. But it's just a slow process.
Yes, very slow. So as I mentioned before, you're at the University of Washington and you're in your first year, your doctoral program. So are you able to just speak a little bit about what your focus is and in terms of your research while you're there?
Yeah. So I, like I mentioned before, focus on critical special education. So really challenging special education. I like to say that I'm kind of doing an inside job of like dismantling it. Because I think there should be no general and special education. It's just education. So yeah, thinking about that and specifically the discipline of Black and Brown children in schools. And one class I'm taking right now is culturally sustaining pedagogies with Django Paris. He's amazing. And so I'm really excited to be learning about that and like kind of meshing it with my perspectives on disability, justice, and discrit. And so, yeah, I hope to produce some sort of qualitative research, talking to students, hopefully, or helping teachers kind of rethink behavior in the classroom, and ways to approach behavior in a way that's not managing it. Yeah, I mean, I haven't really fleshed out all of my thoughts, and like I'm just constantly learning new information, and tensions, and also trying to like. There's a lot of like I'm learning this truth, but this is also true, and they're like, just two competing ideas, but they can still be true. But yeah, I'm just kind of like grappling with that right now. So like the first couple of years of my program is just about taking courses and really refining my framework that I want to be using in my research. So yeah, just in that early phase right now.
And if you don't mind me asking, because I'm just curious, as someone who's not in that space, I mean, I did apply for my doctoral program, and I eventually just decided not to pursue the doctorate. So you mentioned that you're taking a qualitative approach.
Mm-hmm.
Now, is part of your thinking um, the fact that there are a lot of quantitative studies that are focused around this topic in terms of just data and different models that are already out there? Is there like a lack of qualitative approaches or studies out there? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I think so. Historically, quantitative approaches has definitely been like the gold standard, I guess, and that ties back to white supremacy culture about just like people want to know numbers and they want to see improvement, and so quantitative research is going to tell you that. But quantitative research doesn't tell you the whole story, right? There's like so many studies that have been harmful to many communities that are historically marginalized, that have brought about things like just deficit perspectives and damage-centered thoughts about Black and Brown communities. And so I want to take a qualitative approach because it's really asking these communities their thoughts, bringing their voices into the research, because for so long research has centered the voices of white people, non-disabled people. So that's kind of why I want to do qualitative research. And yeah, just hearing out the voices of people that we don't often hear from.
And I also think it's easier to manipulate or misconstrue numerical data or quantitative study compared to first person accounts about these same issues, because these are truths that are coming straight out the interviewees' mouths, and
Right.
and they're just speaking their stories. So yeah, I definitely agree with you on that. Yeah, April, we could really talk about this for hours, because
Yes.
there's really so much to unpack. But I do appreciate your perspective on just how ableism and racism just intersect, not just at the K-12 level, but also clearly in higher ed. And just the fact that if we're really going to do this work, we have to be in the business of dismantling these systems that are still being upheld within those different stages of our education system.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So we are approaching the hour, so I do want to close us out with our lightning round. We just have a few quick hitter questions so folks can learn more about you outside this very important work that you're doing. So you are shouldering a huge load, with this work. This work is heavy. It's emotionally heavy. It can be taxing at times. Um, so that being said, you have to be doing something to exercise self-care so you can sustain yourself in this work. So is there anything that you're doing currently to help you sustain that self-care and stay present?
Yeah, I like to watch thought-provoking TV and movies, and I'm currently watching Atlanta,
Ooh.
and yeah, really great show. Do you watch it?
With Donald Glover?
Yep.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I haven't watched the new season yet, but I've watched episodes in the past seasons. Yeah,
Yeah.
great show.
Yeah. This new season is great, and just so many themes about race and racism. Just it's funny. Yeah, definitely you should start watching the next season. And then this other show I just finished is called Severance. It's on Apple TV, and it's all about like capitalism and social control. And basically, the premise is that these people, you can opt into this job where you get into your elevator at work, you go down to your job, and you forget everything that happens outside of work, and so you have no memory of anything outside of work for 8 hours. Then you go back in the elevator, go home, and you have no recollection of anything you did at work. So it is really, really interesting. I highly recommend that show.
All right, cool. Um, Outside of a book that you have to read for your class, is there any book that you're reading for leisure currently?
No, I don't have time for leisurely reading. But one book that I would recommend to every educator is Troublemakers by Carla Shalaby. Yeah, definitely kind of touches on a lot of things that we talked about today. But it was just really enjoyable to read. So,
All right, awesome. Troublemakers. Have to add that to the queue. Um, if you could invite three influential figures, dead or alive, to dinner, who would they be for you? Who's at the table?
Kid Cudi.
Oh,
I
nice.
love Kid Cudi. I love what he's done. for other people in the way that he kind of brought mental health issues to the forefront. And I love his music. Gloria Ladson-Billings, super nerdy answer.
OG.
Yeah, she's like the goat of academia.
Yeah.
Amazing scholar that brought us the theories of education, debt, and rethinking the achievement gap, and also culturally relevant pedagogy.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the second one. And the last person would be Zendaya. She just seems really cool.
Yeah, those are three awesome people. So you're the first person who's mentioned Kid Cudi and Zendaya at the table. So no, that's awesome. But GLB is someone that has been mentioned many times, as she should be.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that's a dope table. I love it. But listen, April, thank you again for coming on. This has been a great conversation, and I'm just wishing you much success as you go through this doctoral program, because I know it's a lot of work.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you so much for this work that you're doing also.
Yes, thank you so much. And wishing you a good rest of the day, and hopefully we'll connect another time.
Yeah, sounds good.
All
Have a
right.
great one.
Thank you.
Yeah, bye.
Bye-bye. All right, y'all. So we're about to end another episode of IDTALK4ED Educators Live. And as always, I wish you all good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are in the world. And we're going to do this again another time. Peace out, everybody.